Welcome to Whoatv's UK wrap-up. I'm Alan Murphy, and joining me today is Jay Furness, UKMMA, Danny Mitchell, UFC fighter, Sandu from MMA Mount, Jordan Watson from MMA Plus, and Jonathan Schrager, videographer from mixedmartialarts.com. First topic for discussion is the increased number of shows across the UK landscape.
Yeah, I work in a lot of capacities on a lot of different shows. I mean, with obviously the media, obviously as an outsider looking in from that respect, you know, as a coach, you know, going there with guys, cornering guys, as a fighter, you know, knowing how to get treated by the promotion, and officiating as well. I do commentary, occasionally referee, you know, sometimes judging. There's a big range of shows, and from top to bottom you find you can have a tiny show with 200 people that's run the right way, not cutting the corners, they're trying to do the right things for the fighters, and at the same time you can have a big show with upwards of 1,000 people there who are, you know, doing lots of little things wrong. And what you want is to separate the wheat from the chaff with regards to the shows that are trying to do things professionally, they're trying to do the best for the fighters. And I think with, you know, the UKMMA thing moving along, I think when that gets brought in, obviously, like boxing, there might be sort of a licensed and an unlicensed, but I don't think that's a bad thing, because you're going to get the real people who want to go by the book, who are not cutting corners for a few extra quid. And what will happen is, you know, they'll keep promoting the shows. The margins are smaller, but you know, they promote for their love and not because, you know, they're just trying to make more money off the back of everyone else. I think there is too many shows, and that's the reason why there's some dilution, and people are finding shows that aren't of a real good level to fight on, you know what I mean? But when this comes in, I think what you'll see is a bit of an exodus of the shows that can't quite hit that mark or aren't prepared to, you know, go the extra yard to look after the fighters, make sure it's a good production. So, you know, I don't want to see anybody losing money or doing anything like that, but I don't think it's a bad thing that you're going to see quite a lot of shows go down the pan, and you're going to be left with, you know, a core of good shows that are doing the right things by, you know, the right people. And if I'm at a show, I'll happily, you know, offer some opinions, and if I think something's right or wrong, you know, either way I'll say. But there can't be the amount of shows now with everybody making money, you know, everybody getting the right fights on, everybody putting the right competitive fights on, which is what you see more and more. You see so many shows that guys are forced to put on, you know, these bums, not a journeyman, somebody who just turns up to go down and get his money. And you know, when you're back to the bare bones of the good shows, I think the fights will be a lot better. You know, you can start knocking these guys on the head, and you can cherry pick from the best gyms and stuff. So there is too much as it stands, but I think moving forward, there's plans in place that'll see things get better. You know, just the elite, you know, the core and the good people, I think will be what's left.
So just following on from Jay, I pretty much agree with everything he just said. Just to sum up, I think it's just more a work in progress more than anything else. Yes, there's an increased number of shows and promotions here in the UK, and organisations like, for example, Safe MMA, you know, have been, you know, set up to try and provide things like, you know, fighter safety, and try and get the sport as regulated as we can here in the UK. You know, outside of support from the government itself, like it is in the US. Ultimately, I think it just means more opportunities for fighters, especially the fighters that are serious about this, serious about making it all the way to the top. We're talking about, you know, fighting for promotions like Cage Warriors, or the UFC or Bellator or World Series of Fighting, really getting to the big shows. So I think more than anything else, it's providing fighters the opportunities to fight, and to fight regularly, and get that experience, whether it be at an amateur level or working local shows, just to get into the habit of taking the sport more seriously, getting skills like working with the media, and just building up their profile. And obviously, you know, we've got Danny here. You know, he can, you know, maybe speak more about this in terms of what the journey that he's been on to finally make it into the UFC.
Yeah, with the increased number of shows in the UK, it's good because we can see that there's a need there. People want to see MMA, and there's shows every week now. I mean, when I started fighting amateur, I remember getting a lift all the way down to like Worcester or something like that. I fought in a sports hall on some mats. The fight lasted 27 seconds, and then I had to go home. But now you could fight on an organised show pretty much every week. But as Jay said, we need to sort of separate the better shows from the worst. There is still shows that they've not got the proper safety precautions. They might have some guy from St John's ambulance instead of proper paramedics with an ambulance waiting. I think that safety is the biggest issue. I think safety is paramount, and it's only going to take one accident or one problem on that side of things to sort of start to break MMA down. So I think that the safe MMA stuff's really good. A real big thing that I'd like to bring up is the difference between amateur and pro. I think there's sort of blurred lines now in the UK because we're mainly using the American style amateur rules now with the ground and pound. And I've refereed fights, I've promoted fights, and what I don't like to see is these, like, you get a lot of bloody amateur fights. There's lots of blood, and I think amateur fights should be seen as amateur, and they should be like amateur boxing. They should be stopped quickly. If there's blood, the fight should be over. There should be no. Obviously, at amateur level, it's impractical to blood test fighters. I think blood testing should be mandatory for all pros. On any show, blood testing should be mandatory, and obviously amateurs. That would be a massive campaign to do that. So I think maybe the refereeing of amateur fights needs to change. Maybe take out knees to the head and stop fights a lot quicker, and really try and separate the two. Because at the end of the day, amateurs, it's just a hobby. It can be. Some of them are going to go on to fight pro, but I think safety-wise, a lot more needs to be done, because with the increased amount of shows, you've got an increased amount of fighters as well, and it's only a matter of time before we get some serious injuries. So I think that needs to be managed a lot better, the sort of difference between amateur and pro. But again, yeah, I think that it's a time thing. Like you said, a work in progress. Eventually, we're just going to be left with the better shows and the better promotions, and the more we can have. Like blood testing and safe MMA getting involved and things like that, I think that's a lot better for the sport.
Now that there is more local UFC shows happening in different regions around the world, does that make it easier for fighters to get into the UFC? And what effect does this have on the fighters that are on the cusp of getting there and want to pad their records and not risk a loss against a decent level guy?
I do think it's easier for domestic fighters to get on the UFC shows in their home countries. Like this weekend we've got guys like Danny who are making their debut. At the same time we've got guys like Neil Seary. No one really would have expected him to come in, but like media support and fan support, and he got in, and I really didn't see it coming. But at the same time, I think fighters have still got to put the work in. Like after Conor McGregor came along, there was talk of Cathal Pendred following him, and why he's having to go through tough because he couldn't get the call up. And I think that's because he put out a lot of decisions, he's having a lot of decision wins, and you've still got to attract that attention. You've still got to do something to make the UFC look at you. But yeah, definitely, I think it's definitely noticeable when you go to other countries. There's a lot of fighters you haven't come across before, or you'll see that they've done some big things in local shows here and there. Yeah.
I echo the sentiments there. I mean, it's great that the more of our fighters have the platform now to perform at the highest level in the UFC. I just think the UFC's got to be slightly mindful of not diluting the shows, and when I say that, I mean to try and get some star power on the main card to attract more fans, casual fans as well, to the stadium, so that they can pack out arenas, and therefore at the same time give a better platform to the sort of slightly lesser known UK fighters at this stage, to give them more higher profile really. And the best example I can provide is in 2009 UFC 105 at what at the time was the MEN Arena. That was jam-packed, whereas when it was Machida versus Munoz, a card that was sort of criticised for not carrying a lot of marquee names, the stadium, the Phones for You now, was only half full. So if MMA is meant to be progressing and it's only half, within 5 years it's sort of half the audience, then to me that was an indication that the UFC really needs to be mindful that it has to really promote and have some really high power stars as well to support the lesser known UK fighters at this stage.
Just following on there, I think that the UFC have been in a transitional period over the last couple of years, just trying to figure out what their eventual plan would be in regional markets, and I think we're finally starting to see some of that now. Obviously, the O2 Arena, we haven't been back. Well, the UFC hasn't been back there since Bisping versus Akiyama a few years ago, but they are back there and they've sold it out. And I think they've sold it out because they have got a stellar main event there. So I think we'll start to see them kind of react to some of the events that have taken place here in Europe and in the UK specifically over the last couple of years, and make sure that they do bring good marquee fighters and bring a good marquee main event to their shows over here in the UK. And just a quick point on fighters having a padded record. I think that's probably more for the media to criticise more than anybody else, and maybe some of the hardcore fans. Because at the end of the day, if you're a casual UFC fan, if you're watching the UFC for the very first time, you see one fighter beating another fighter, all you're going to see is that winner, that fighter that has won that fight, beat a UFC caliber fighter at the end of the day. So that's probably more down to the UFC deciding who they want in their promotion more than anybody else. Because at the end of the day, you can ask Danny right now. He's good enough to fight in the UFC. So technically speaking, he's a UFC caliber fighter. Otherwise, he wouldn't be here, right? So if his opponent defeats him on Saturday night, then his opponent's got a good victory over him because he's a UFC caliber fighter. So I think that's probably more. Could be up for debate whether fighters that are fighting on these regional cards, whether it be in China or in Brazil or in Europe, whether they have a padded record, is really up for more debate.
I read an article not so long back, and it was called, I think, The Death of the UFC Caliber Fighter, and some points of it I think were quite poignant in that there is guys coming in now who, a few years ago wouldn't have ever got a chance to fight in the UFC. I think Royston Wee was the focus of the article. He was 2-0, but he ended up winning his fight, But people forget the UFC is the pinnacle of the sport, but it's not like a Premiership league. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, it's the pinnacle of the sport because they've got the biggest brand. But what they're doing worldwide is trying to grow their brand, and it doesn't matter to them if the fighter that's growing the brand has padded his record, or if he's up there. If you're putting millions into marketing, say the Ultimate Fighter in China, you don't want your guy in there to be the guy that you invested time in, resources, money. You don't want that guy to be, shown up, or you want him to prove his worth. You're doing that for a purpose, to build the audience in that area. And whilst he may have not got his shot before, while what you're trying to do is it's purely business. It's not. They're not saying this guy will be the featherweight world champion or this guy will be the welterweight world champion. What they're saying is we're trying to build our business here, which will generate more revenue, generate more profits. And I think what you'll see is it's more of a regional turn, and you will get guys who are regional level UFC fighters, but maybe not world level UFC fighters, and that's perfectly fine if everybody is aware that it is a business. There's no saying that this is the Premier League. It happens to be, but the UFC don't have to promote like that. It's the business, and they're building it that way. And I think guys are getting opportunities sooner than they might have normally, or without taking on the kind of opposition they would have normally. But at the same time, you've got a lot of guys who are paying their dues just as they were before. There's a lot of better fighters outside of the UFC now. I mean, Danny's here, so it's an example. Danny's, fought UFC caliber fighters outside of the UFC for years, and he's beaten guys that have been in the UFC. So it's not an automatic in that it's easier now to do it, but there are ways that do make it easier. So it's swings and roundabouts. If your face fits, and you fit into that business plan, you might get an easier opportunity. Otherwise, there's still guys there working just as hard.
From a fighter standpoint, now that it's slightly easier to get into the UFC, would you say that a fighter who's 7-0, fighting regional guys, would not want to risk that and get a couple of easy wins in order to become a 10-0 fighter, which is more marketable for the UFC to promote?
It's funny you should ask that actually, because it is quite topical. I mean, I just signed for a new management company, and they've got UFC guys, and they're one of the biggest in the world at doing what they do, and I'm sure the opportunity would be there for me once you've already established a good record and whatnot, to say, maybe one or two more, and you're almost guaranteed a spot. We've got the in, but that all will depend on the person, I think, because they said that to me, and I said I'm not going to turn down any good opportunities or tough fights, on a maybe, a whimsical maybe from the UFC. I said I'd rather take the opportunities that are there, and again, if you've built up a record to a certain point where you fought tough guys already, and then I guess one or two wins over cans is not going to make a difference if you've already fought the tough guys and had the tough back and forth fights. But what you find is the guys who haven't, there's a certain way to build your heart is to be in a back and forth fight and show that you can grit it out and do it. But if you've raced to 10-0 and you've fought nobody who's ever pushed back, then when that does come, if you're finding that out in the big leagues, then you're just going to be embarrassed in front of more people. It's you can get there, it's easier to get there, but it's also easier to wash out, and it's so hard, particularly for UK guys. Can you name me a UK guy or an Irish fighter who's ever washed out of the UFC and got back? It's damn near impossible. So I think your better bet is to, really work at your career first and build it from there. And that's, you're building a more solid foundation than, build it on a foundation of tomato cans that can easily collapse.
Yeah, with regards to that, like you say, these guys, they get close, they're on the cusp of the UFC, and then I can see the pressure is there to sort of just get a few easy wins and try and get in that way. But I mean, my last fight was a risky fight. I could have avoided that fight, no problem. But I took that fight, and I think based on that risk taken and winning that fight is what pretty much got me this contract. So I think it's important to take those risks and have those tough fights. Like you say, you got a 7-0 guy. If all those fights were tough, hard fights, then yeah, they could have a few steady fights. That's everybody's entitled to those fights. I know I've had steady fights if I've come back from an injury or something like that. Sometimes you need just a little stepping stone to get to the next stage. But when it's time, you need to prove yourself, and you need to take a risk, and you need to go into the lion's den. And I think that it's important that the fighters that are selected, when you do look back through the record, you can see that at some point. It doesn't have to be the last fight was that tough one. But I think that at some point in the career, they have to have gone through that. So yeah, I think that's pretty important. But I can see what you're talking about, that people they don't want to take those risks now. But I've always been about that. Is just jumping in, and you've got to, like Jay said, if you can't prove yourself on the domestic or regional scene, then you're gonna get a shock when you step up. So I think that's really important that they've been in those scenarios.
Yes, just to follow up and just to wrap up this quickly, I personally think it comes down to a fighter's confidence in his or her own abilities, to be honest. I mean, Danny just mentioned right there that his last fight before coming to the UFC was a very risky fight for him, but he took it on. And I think another great example of this is the Londoner who's main eventing this Saturday's UFC card. I think a lot of people may not realise this, or maybe some people forget. Jimmy Manuel was offered a chance to fight in the UFC before he actually got here. He turned it down. He wanted to take his time to round out his abilities, to make sure he had the right level of experience. And then when he thought the time was right, then the offer was still on the table for him. But it comes down to the fighter to just decide whether he thinks he or she thinks that they're ready to step up and fight UFC caliber competition. So that's the final point I want to make on this. I think it comes down to a fighter and a fighter's confidence in his or her own abilities as a mixed martial artist first and foremost.
Moving on to the main event now, Saturday night, Jimmy Winu is fighting Alexander Gustafsson. This could have major implications on the title scene.
Yeah, if Jimmy wins this, it puts him right up there. I think that he's got a real tough fight. Obviously, he's got that knockout power, but Gustafsson is going to have a good game plan coming into this, and I think that he's not going to stand there and he's not going to take them shots at him. If he does want to prove a point and stand there and trade with him, then I think he will get knocked out, and Jimmy will win. But I think that Gustafsson's probably approaching this in a bit of a smarter way, so I think he's definitely up against it. But a win over Gustafsson obviously puts him in that top spot.
To echo Danny's sentiments there, I mean, it is a really tough fight on paper. Sort of difficult to envisage Jimmy winning, unless obviously, like Danny said, Alex is wanting to make a point and stand in the pocket with him. I do think he'll have a game plan, sort of similar to the Shogun Rua fight, where he'll probably remain on the outside and point score his way to a victory. It's 5 rounds, it's difficult to do that the whole time, so at times he might have to tough it out, but I do think he'll prevail ultimately. But at the end of the day, this is MMA, very unpredictable sport. It's hometown advantage. Jimmy doesn't know what it feels like to lose. And he's a bit of an unknown entity in some respects, because he's had 3 fights in the UFC, but only really the first one sort of showed us much, because the subsequent 2 kind of were curtailed due to injuries to his opponent. So he's a little bit of an unknown entity in some ways, Jimmy, at this level. So it'll be fascinating to see if he can step up and do the business. In terms of title implications, I think it really depends on the fashion in which the fight goes. If he can win impressively, if, for example, he comes out and blows, demolishes him in 1 round, that may attach a bit more credence to the idea that he could be a viable contender to John Jones. Otherwise, I think people might be sceptical about that. But yeah, either way, I think it'll be a cracking main event.